Greetings, everyone. I'm Doug Peach, Folklife Specialist at the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I'm here today with my colleague, Dr. Nancy Groce, Senior Folklife Specialist also at the American Folklife Center, for a conversation with Dr. Melissa Cooper. Dr. Melissa Cooper is an Associate Professor in the Department of History at Rutgers University-Newark. She specializes in African American intellectual and cultural history, as well as the history of the African Diaspora. She's the author of Making Gullah, A History of Sapelo Islanders, Race, and the American Imagination, which was published as part of the John Hope Franklin series by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017. Dr. Cooper has just given a wonderful lecture here at the Library of Congress, and we're here for an informal discussion about her life, her career, and her research. So, Dr. Cooper, welcome to the Library of Congress.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're delighted you're here. That was a lovely lecture. Can you start by just saying a little bit about how you got interested in Gullah culture, Gullah research?
Well, I have roots in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, and certainly having familial ties to the region increased my interest in its history, its past, and the way that it was labeled sort of Gullah territory, and wanting to know what that meant, especially because I hadn't, until recent years, heard lots of people in these communities talking about themselves in those terms in the ways that they have been described and talked about in research. So, you know, as a descendant of these communities, I wanted to know more about that.
And you grew up in Gullah country or elsewhere? Where did you
No,
grow up?
I am the child of migrants, third wave migrants, so I grew up in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But do you still have family in the area?
Yes, and a part of being, you know, a child of migrants, which is, you know, probably a ritual that many children of migrants experience, you know, Black Southern migrants who came to cities in the North, in the West during any of the three waves of the Great Migration, is that there were always trips south, you know, for the summer to visit family, on holidays. So, you know, taking the trek back south was also just a part of our family experience. And so regular trips to the Low Country were a part of life growing up for me.
So in addition to this family influence on your work, can you talk about maybe some of the other books, some of the other authors, maybe fellow scholars or parts of your work in academia that may have inspired parts of Making Gullah?
Well, certainly I understood that intellectual and cultural history was the way that I was going to make sense of how the evolution of the identity, where it came from and what it meant. Mm-hmm. And so I worked closely with my mentor and dissertation director, Mia Bay, who's an amazing intellectual historian, and scholars like Beryl Satter, to really help me to ask some tough questions and to read these sources in a way within the time period and in a way to help me detect which had largely gone undetected by scholars who thought about Gullah folk or Low Country Black. You know, the application of the intellect, the kinds of questions that scholars who study intellectual and cultural history bring to the archive and to their research topics and subjects are different, and they helped to illuminate so much of what had been obscured.
Were you encouraged to go into Gullah study? I know you study things other than Gullah, but to focus on Gullah, was that for your dissertation?
It was for my dissertation, but it also, I started, you know, it began with my master's thesis where I started to try to ask questions about the tension I observed in the sources between the way that Sapelo Islanders and other Low Country Blacks were described and talked about by the people who studied them, as opposed to the lived experiences of people in those communities over time. And so I knew that this was a question about the Black past that needed to be answered. You know, originally, though, it didn't seem that there was a lot of room. For many scholars, many historians, all that had been said about the Gullah had been said. and that there wasn't sort of new ground to cover. And the question was about intervention. Well, what's new? What is there that we haven't figured out about these people and their past? And my response was, well, we haven't figured out, how we have come to study these people and their past and why. And that was a history that I felt needed to be uncovered. And there were some questions about why did we start to study these people, to give them a specific identity and label, and what did that mean, and how did that change over time? So there was a history that hadn't been conceptualized. It was the history of the production of studying folk and making of folk and folk culture.
You know, Dr. Cooper, every book is a process, right? And when I read your book, there were several moments of just surprises of, wow, this person was writing about this. Can you tell us about one surprise or some memorable surprise during your research or in the writing of this book that stands out to you?
There were so many. As you could imagine, there were so many. You know, books just carry this sort of authority in our cultural worlds, right? We sometimes imagine that things that end up between the covers of a book are somehow so much more real than other things. That is, of course, you know, a fiction. But I was so surprised to find that the actual construction and the production of so many of these studies were just fraught with all sorts of problems. And to learn things like that the National Geographic photo spread of the Johnson family, to learn things through oral history interviews, like that the photographer had, you know, put in the neighbor's children to create an image of this family, was really, those types of discoveries were quite jarring, for sure.
And your book really is a classic. So do you want to talk a little
thank
bit?
you.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the reaction to it?
Well, I mean, you know, in terms of reviews, it seemed to have been received well in the Academy, for sure. But I was also a bit surprised at the life that the book has outside of the Academy. And it was my hope that people would be able to pick up the book and really make sense of it, whether they were, you know, deep students of intellectual and cultural history, or they were readers who just wanted to learn more, or people in the communities who had been subject to this type of scrutiny. So I intentionally wrote the book so that everyone could really sort of sit down with this past and make sense of it. So I'm quite pleased and was a bit surprised to learn that it had a life, so much more of a life, even outside the Academy than I expected, in terms of the publics that I'm asked to engage and talk to about the study. It's really mirrored that, and that has been a welcome consequence of writing the book.
It was interesting when you were talking about intervention, when you were formulating this book about what would be the intervention. We know these historical questions, we've answered them. Mm-hmm. You have obviously made an intervention on this research, so I'm wondering, you know, what do you see, what is it, almost 7 years since the book has been published. Mm. What's the next step in Gullah Geechee research, and maybe even more specifically, if you could add a chapter to your book, what might that last chapter be? That's a
great question. I do think there will continue to be new chapters that could be added to the book as these communities face new threats, ranging from land loss and, you know, maybe even climate imposed sort of disaster. There's going to be lots of new turns in the story of Blacks who live in the Low Country, for sure. So a new chapter could be on any of those topics, an additional chapter. But I do think in terms of the future, for those who would like to study Gullah history, I think that there's so much work that needs to be done to tease out the specifics of things that have happened, really sort of the change of hands in terms of property when we think about land loss. And there are studies yet to be written about the ways that policies and zoning practices and municipal and county level politics have impacted the outcomes of people in these communities. There's more work to be done to sort of historicize and report and preserve the activities of people in these communities who have been really at the forefront of protecting, preserving their communities, or creating educational opportunities in these communities and educational opportunities. So, I mean, because we've so fixated on a certain level or dimension of Black life in these communities, and we've avoided and excluded so many of the other realities that impact people who live, Black people who live in the Low Country, that has left this whole many fields of research and study, especially in terms of historical experience, that's yet to be mined.
Now, I know you're a historian, but I must say, as folklorists, we really admire how much traditional culture and research on quotidian culture you put into your works. Would you like to say a little bit about how you see the interactions of the field?
Well, that's a really interesting question. You know, I think we like to imagine that the lines between the disciplines are hard and fast, and certainly our methods are different. But in order to really produce rigorous and meaningful intellectual and cultural history, there is a sort of interdisciplinary analysis and different ways of thinking about the subjects that we study that need to be employed. So I think that there are things that we can learn from folklorists, you know, lots of different alternative ways of reading phenomenon and people and practices and traditions, but then also things that we should be willing to, critiques that we should be willing to bring to the study of, or the disciplines that capture and preserve and present the folk to readers and or, you know, publics in lots of different ways.
You know, Dr. Cooper, I'm interested again in a little bit of your life history, and you were a teacher,
I was.
correct?
I was.
Yes.
I was a high school social studies teacher for more than a decade, definitely.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the experiences or skills that you gained from that work and how that informs your work now?
Well, that's a great question. I loved teaching high school. It was, I believe it's a great calling for those who find themselves involved deeply in their hearts and souls in K through 12 education. And I think that one of the gifts that my high schoolers gave me that I was able to bring to my craft as a historian, and definitely my craft as a professor, is in telling complicated stories in a way that people can understand, and to make big things manageable and intellectually digestible was really helpful, for sure. And helping, and always asking myself, why does this matter, right? Because before you can package something and sort of present it or teach it to other people, you have to be really clear on what's at stake. So having spent time as a public educator definitely encouraged me to always think about what's at stake in storytelling. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming to the Library of Congress.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper.